Hello, everyone. We'll be getting started in just a minute or two. Oh, I see that Jayati's back. Okay, well, I can get started. My name is Melanie. I am the co-chair of the Eco-Socialist Subcommittee of GSA's International Committee, and I'll be moderating today. Just to get started, I'll briefly say that a little over a year ago, the World Health Organization declared COVID-19 to be a global pandemic, marking the official start of a profound global economic crisis alongside that of the health crisis. This disease outbreak was likely caused by the interplay between capitalist agriculture and urban development, and state responses to it at the nation state and global system level have in turn been shaped by structures of hierarchy and domination, colonialism, racism, neoliberalism, and capitalism. Vaccine apartheid persists, and to date, the International Monetary Fund anticipates that only the US and China will return to pre-pandemic growth trajectories, meaning that we remain in a state of global economic crisis with no global recovery on the horizon. The reasons for this abhorrent reality are again rooted in global economic structures, which for many of us can feel both abstract and intangible, and therefore unchangeable. Well, today, as always for DSA, our aim is to change the world, first by understanding how the inequalities of the global economic order have hindered the global South's recovery, how things could be otherwise, and how we as socialists in the US can organize to exert power to successfully unlock a global just recovery. We are joined today by Dr. Jayati Ghosh, a development economist at UMass Amherst, and by Alex Main, the Director of International Policy at the Center for Economic Policy Research. Both are eminent researchers and advocates for structural global economic transformation. First, Dr. Ghosh will provide us with an unflinching overview of the global political and economic situation, and then Alex will discuss critical levers for US action, in particular, the robust international response to the Pandemic Act, for which GSA members across the US are currently organizing. This centers on a technical instrument called special drawing rights, hence the subtitle of our panel. Following their two opening statements, I will ask a few questions, both pre-prepared by panel organizers and then also drawing from the audience. So please feel free to post your questions in the Q&A box. So please note, I'm sure most people have been on Zoom webinars at this point, but notice that the Q&A box is separate from the chat. And then we'll close the discussion by DSA's own Tyler on ways to get involved with organizing for the robust international response to the Pandemic Act and beyond. So over to you, Jayati.
Thanks so much, Melanie, and thank you for inviting me, everyone. I'm really happy to be part of this. So I'm going to begin by talking a little bit about the world before the pandemic, the before times, I think they're called over here. And really to point out that global capitalism was already very frayed and in some disrepair, and that most parts of the developing world were actually not in good shape at all economically or in terms of the welfare of the population. And this is often hard for people here to believe because, there's this whole notion of China doing so well and East Asia rising, and the myth about India had collapsed a while before, but there's this general thing about how a lot of developing and emerging markets are growing faster than the advanced economies, and it's the advanced economies that are sick rather than the developing world. I think this masks a really significant aspect of even the growth in the developing countries, which is that it was hugely unequal, and that the majority of the population faced worse material conditions, not just not growing faster, but worse material conditions in terms of, in India, we had falling real wages, we had falling consumption, for example. We actually in India even had falling investment, but India may be an outlier in that respect. Many, many developing countries had massively increased inequality with significantly increased food poverty, with much more fragile employment, with much greater emphasis on informal contracts, part-time work. 70% of all the workers in the developing world are informal. And in some countries like India, it's as high as 90%. So we were talking about a global capitalism that was not in very good shape beforehand. And it was also a very unequal global capitalism, even geographically, as we know. But there was a perception that these things were changing because of relatively faster growth rates, most of all in China, which, as I'm sure you know better than me, is a real obsession of the North. Yes, the fact that it's growing fast, that it has so many people, and that they are bidding to become a power in their own right, perhaps threatening the existing advanced powers and so on. The pandemic, I think, exposed quite brutally how the underlying structures of global capitalism, indeed of the international order, economic, financial, legal architecture, are deeply unequal and deeply unjust. Because we've had a whole range of things happen, but let me just highlight some of them. First, we have the whole issue of the vaccines and the fact that, this is, at one level, it's incredible. This has been the fastest delivery of vaccines ever in the history of the world, because a lot of money was thrown at vaccines. Public research and public money was thrown at R&D for vaccine development, so that, in fact, all of the major vaccine candidates have been heavily subsidized by public sector research, by public sector subsidies, and by public sector pre-purchases, government pre-purchases of the vaccines. All of them made massive profits already in the first 6 months after their approval. And yet they were allowed to retain control over the knowledge, which was almost entirely public funded in many of these cases. And that has had huge implications. So what it has meant is that the vaccine supply is limited. And many countries in the world, even those who can afford to buy the vaccines, cannot buy them because whatever supply there is has been bought up by the developed countries. We had an obscene vaccine grab, okay, from mid-October, when the first approvals were announced. And even before that, actually, the major advanced countries bought up 85% of the supply for 2021. Okay, 10 countries bought up 85% of the supply. And it was really like those, the bully kids in the school parties who go and grab all the birthday cake even when they can't eat it themselves. So Canada pre-purchased 11 times what it needs. The US, 4.5 times what it needs, and so on and so on. The UK, 3 times what it needs. I could go on. Basically, everybody was greedy, grabbed as much as they could. When they ended up with larger than they needed supplies, they stockpiled them. So there is currently 1.6 billion in stockpiled vaccines in these countries that grabbed it in advance. And many of them have actually had to be thrown away. I'm quite curious what's happened in the US, for example. There were 80 million AstraZeneca vaccines that we kept hearing about that the US had in stocks. And suddenly we never hear about them anymore. They're not even part of the vaccine diplomacy where Biden announces this great generous gift to a few countries. I suspect they've expired and they've been thrown away. And we don't know how many other millions of these have been thrown away. I come from a country where people have lost their lives. Friends of mine, colleagues of mine, children of my friends have lost their lives because we still have only 15% of our population fully vaccinated and 32% part vaccinated. And many other countries, Africa, there's countries with 1% vaccination only. Yet even when they are able to buy, they are unable to buy because now, of course, all of you want booster shots. Now, because of the fact that you allowed the rest of the world to not get access to vaccines, the disease continued, and therefore the virus mutated, and therefore there are threats from the Delta variant, and maybe there will be a Gamma and a Kappa and a Theta and etc. So now, obviously, you need booster shots, which means, once again, the supplies are curtailed. To me, it is absolutely appalling that there is no noise about this, even among progressive voices in the United States. Frankly, I find it both unbelievable and unacceptable. Because what is happening is that the North is not just grabbing all the available vaccine production, but preventing greater production by allowing these companies to hoard the knowledge, not forcing them to share the technology. There are many companies willing and able to produce these vaccines, if only the technology would be shared. But they're not being allowed because these companies want to continue making their super profits. The governments are going along with them, and the people are okay with it, the people of the North. I'm sorry, but that's the way it's seen in the rest of the world. The other very sharp and immediate sign of the deep inequality that persists is in terms of the fiscal responses. Now, you are all living in the country that has had the greatest fiscal response of all, okay? The IMF estimated that between January 2020 and March 2021, of the nearly 10 trillion of additional public spending that has occurred, 10 countries, once again, 10 countries, and no guessing which ones those are. They're very similar to the vaccine grabbers. 10 countries account for around 75% of the total spending. The US, no, sorry, 86% of the total spending. The US alone accounts for 55% of the total spending, okay? All of the rest of the world, which is what, 80% of the population, gets very tiny, what, 12, 14% of the additional spending. Let me put it in another way. The US additional fiscal spending stimulus has been estimated at anywhere between $25,000 to $30,000 per capita. Now, maybe you can argue about how it was spent and maybe not enough reached a lot of the really poor, all that's fine, but $25,000 to $30,000 per capita additionally was spent over this period. What is the average for low-income countries? $2 per capita. $2 per capita additionally spent, okay? 25,000, 2. That's the kind of differential we're looking at. And why is this? Why is it that suddenly the advanced economies discovered all this fiscal space and said, oh, you know, all the talk about public debt, etc., suddenly disappeared? I mean, okay, for the US, it's back again, but that's because you have a really dysfunctional system. That's different. But, you know, the economics of it, neoliberalism that had kept saying you cannot possibly do more public spending, suddenly said, oh, sure, go out there and spend across the advanced world. Developing countries were not able to the same degree. And there are 3 reasons for this. The first is that many of them are having very large sovereign debt overhang. They face very large debts to the point where debt servicing, even during the pandemic, has accounted for more of the public revenues than health spending, okay? And there's no attempt to do proper sovereign debt resolution, and so this persists. The second reason is because the pandemic led to a dramatic collapse in revenues, of course, everywhere, because economic activity stopped, right? You had lockdowns, you had slowdowns, you couldn't actually have the same level of economic activity, which meant tax revenues went down. And these are all countries terrified of running deficits because of the fear of capital flight. Because the minute they have a fiscal deficit that is larger than 2, 3, 4%, credit rating agencies downgrade them, capital moves out, their bond markets, basically their bonds collapse in price and the yields rise, making it harder for them to borrow. So they're terrified, and therefore they self-censor. They do not actually spend even when they can. It's not inflation that's holding them back. It is really the fear of global capital, which is holding them back. Now, in this context, what can we do? Which is why some of the discussion about SDRs is so important, the special drawing rights of the IMF. I'm sure Alex is going to tell you a lot more detail about that, so I'm not going to elaborate. But the point about these is that this is like, you know, it's free liquidity. I mean, it's basically just an accounting unit in the IMF, but it increases every country's reserves. Now, it's true that an additional allocation of these SDRs, 500 billion SDRs, which is about $650 billion, disproportionately again goes to the rich countries, right? All because that they're the ones with the bigger quotas in the IMF. So they will get like 65% of the new money. But even that smaller share, which is going to developing countries, can be a lifeline for some of them because they are facing very big balance of payments constraints. They can use that to get rid of some of the debt, you know, devote money to other purposes, etc. So they can do something with that money. It's not what we wanted. It's come more than a year after it was demanded. It's much less than we needed, but nonetheless, it's something. Now, the other thing that you can do with this is actually because the rich countries that are going to get 65% of the SDRs are not going to use it. I mean, the US doesn't need SDRs. It's got It's got the US dollar, it's got the global reserve currency. Most advanced economies are not going to use the additional SDRs. They haven't used any SDRs in their accounts for decades. The surplus economies are not going to use their SDRs. So let's actually bring in a mechanism to recycle these SDRs to the countries that need them. This is free money. It's, if you translate the SDRs into some other currency, any currency, dollars, euro, yen, whatever, you pay a tiny interest rate, 0.06% or something. It's fiscally trivial. It doesn't really matter. So you could actually, it's very easy. I don't even think it requires going to US Congress. It's very easy for the US to say, we're allocating our SDRs to the following countries or to the following things. What could the US do? It could, for example, fund COVAX, which is the global facility for ensuring that vaccines reach everybody. It could fund COVAX as much as it needs to actually provide vaccines to everybody. Currently, COVAX has got about $8 billion. It needs at the minimum 30 billion. Okay, that's nothing. The US is going to get what, 380 billion in SDRs? It just has to give 30 billion to COVAX. It won't notice. Nobody will notice. To fund it, to buy vaccines, to distribute, to give to the people of the world. It could fund CTAP, the COVID-19 Technology Access Pool, which is, again, based in the WHO, which is the idea where companies and countries share technologies. Now, what's happened? No company has joined. The countries that have joined don't have money. So what could those who are sitting on all of these and will get another gift of SDRs do? They could actually, for example, put enough money into CTAP to enable it to buy up patents. We have been trying in the WTO, in the World Trade Organization, many of us have been trying now for a year and a half again, to get a waiver on the TRIPS, on the intellectual property rules that are preventing, the patent laws that are preventing technology transfer. It's not working. Wyden finally relaxed his opposition, but let's face it, it was a PR job because he didn't really push for it subsequently in the WTO. And other countries, Germany, France, they're resisting, so it's not going to happen. So until then, what do we do? At least buy up some of these patents, distribute the knowledge. These are things which are what are called low-hanging fruit. They can be done very easily, very cheaply, without anyone noticing and without anybody being hurt, anybody being adversely affected. Yet I don't see a demand for any of this in the developed world. And frankly, that shocks me. Some of it is ignorance. Some of it is because the mainstream media, your mainstream media is not as bad as ours, but it's not great either. Doesn't talk about the global economy, doesn't bother, doesn't care about the rest of the world. But some of it is actually because I think the pandemic has made people very inward looking. And to us, relatively minor insecurities that have emerged because of the pandemic in the developed world suddenly seem very large. I assure you they're minor. Compared to what everybody in the developing world is facing, they're incredibly minor. But if you could recognize that, and if you could generate enough of a momentum to demand or shame the government into doing these very obvious, inexpensive, and ridiculously easy things, then at least there would be a little bit of some kind of progress towards international solidarity. Otherwise, and I'm sorry to be frank, but I have to tell you this, people in the developing countries, they stopped believing their own state and states in the developed world a while ago. But I think they're also increasingly cynical about people in the North because they don't see the noise demanding what seems to them and to all of us to be obvious. I think I've said enough to be provocative, so let me stop here.
No, that was great. Hopefully Alex can be just as provocative. Over to you.
I'll try. Not sure I can quite manage. So yeah, I'm at the Center for Economic and Policy Research, and that's a very long and dull name, so you can just call us CEPR for short. And I've been asked to be laser focused on SDRs, on special drawing rights in my presentation. And I just want to say that I do agree with everything that Jayati said, and particularly on, trying to get some of those low-hanging fruit. But I'm glad to be talking about SDRs because I happen to focus on SDRs a lot in my work. And I also really do think that they are critical and could help developing countries enormously in getting through the pandemic and particularly its economic effects. And first of all, I just want to, well, I'd also like to thank DSA, the International Committee, and particularly the Economy and Trade Subcommittee for organizing this. I think it's great. I hope you do many more of these sorts of webinars on more technical issues that actually have enormous impact on an enormous part of humanity. But yeah, I wanted to start by just prefacing my presentation by saying that I'm actually not in the habit at all of singing the praise of any IMF policy. For those that know CEPR, you probably know that we are constant critics of the IMF and of most of its policy agenda. And we've published studies showing how IMF policies have played a big role in generating 2 lost decades of economic growth in places like Latin America. And we've done a lot of studies on disastrous policies in places like Argentina and Greece and Latvia that have been promoted by the IMF. But special drawing rights, SDRs, are quite a bit different from most IMF policies, from all other IMF policies, really. And what's good about SDRs is that the IMF really has no control over how countries use them. So SDRs, and Jayati, I thought, explained it quite well and succinctly. I'm not sure I can do such a succinct job, but they're assets that are created by the IMF. Their value is based on a basket of the major global currencies, and they can be used to supplement countries' international reserves. That's where they first end up when they're distributed, or they can be converted to dollars, euros, renminbi, or other major global currencies. And it costs nothing to release SDRs, to issue new SDRs. It's zero cost to US taxpayers and to taxpayers anywhere, as a matter of fact. And I think perhaps most significantly is that, unlike, say, with IMF loans, there are no conditions attached to receiving SDRs, and they don't need to be paid back. And so the IMF plays a minimal role of sort of administrator of SDRs. They distribute them, they help countries exchange them for cash, and that's it. And that's how we like it. And so, as I said, SDRs can be used to bolster international reserves, which helps stabilize their finances, helps countries that are facing balance of payments crises in particular, and it helps them free up other resources for public spending. But I think most importantly, they can be exchanged for hard cash and used for fiscal purposes, for public spending, including purchasing much needed imports, sadly, vaccines at high cost. But also public health programs, other social programs, helping the unemployed workers in those countries, essentially helping stimulate the economy the way wealthy countries have done. And there's a big fight going on around how SDRs can be used with central banks, particularly those of a neoliberal disposition, that are trying to prevent, some of the states, some of the governments from using their SDRs. And there's a very good handbook that my colleague Andres Arauz has come up with on the fiscal use of SDRs, which shows that SDRs under the IMF Articles of Agreement belong to states, not central banks. And so that really should, really shut up all the people in the central banks, but we're seeing major fights going on in places like Mexico and elsewhere, with the central banks trying to hold on to their SDRs. However, what we're seeing this time, and the last time that SDRs was distributed was in 2009, only about 2% of SDRs were used by states back then. The vast majority of them just sat in countries' international reserves. This time around, we're seeing a lot of news. I have colleagues actually that are coming up with sort of a compilation of the way that SDRs are being used this time around. I think countries are really getting it and using them for all sorts of public spending. So very optimistic about the SDRs getting used this time around. And you have a lot of people that are encouraging countries to use them for fiscal purposes. I'd be remiss in not mentioning some of the problems with SDRs. So Jayati already mentioned a big one, which is this absurd structure of the allocation, where less than 40% of the SDRs goes to middle income and low income countries. Only about 1.5% goes to low income countries. And so you get wealthy countries getting the bulk of SDRs, and they don't actually need them. And so, yeah, and another problem with SDRs is the fact that, it's wealthy countries, and particularly the US, that end up deciding on whether new SDRs are going to be released to the world. So not a very democratic process. And it, takes a lot of pushing from developing countries to get SDRs issued the way that they just have, and I'll get into that. But so, we really need to see more SDRs. And I think, Jayati really highlighted the disparities in the public spending we've been seeing during the COVID period, between wealthy countries and poor countries. I mean, it's really, really quite appalling. And the SDRs, again, can really help countries expand their public spending, but there aren't enough of them. And I totally agree with Jayati on the importance of rechanneling SDRs from wealthy countries to less wealthy countries. The one issue that we're seeing right now, well, we're seeing a couple of issues. One is that not many countries are stepping up to the plate. The US has talked about reallocating 20% of their SDR allocation, but they are seeking congressional authority for that. It's not clear that they really need it, but they're seeking it in any case. It's not clear that they're going to get that. Otherwise, France has promised 20% of their SDRs to African countries, but we have very few details on that. And otherwise, we're just not hearing, many commitments coming from wealthy countries. And the other thing is that so far, the only concrete proposals in terms of rechanneling SDRs that are on the table, that are being discussed by, the power brokers, by the oligarchy, by the G20 countries, involve rechanneling SDRs into these IMF-controlled funds that, like the PRGT, the Poverty Reduction and Growth Trust, that involve conditionalities and involve grants, loans rather than grants. So, forcing countries to repay these SDRs that they would receive through these facilities, and adding to their already huge debt burdens. So you're really taking away everything that's good about SDRs through the channeling mechanisms that are currently on the table. And so, a lot of groups, including CEPR, have been calling for, rechanneling mechanisms that involve minimum conditionalities, minimal repayment. But unfortunately, it doesn't look like this is being considered. And so, really, a new allocation seems like a no-brainer. And you have hundreds of groups. Just recently, African governments during the UN General Assembly, they were asking for more SDRs. And the big question is, why isn't this happening? This doesn't cost anything. And the one word, the quick response to that question is Washington, D.C. is why it's not happening. And so the real battleground for SDRs is in Washington. And I expect it's not really news to most of you that, the US largely calls the shot at the International Monetary Fund. And in the case of SDRs specifically, under the Articles of Agreement, the US has veto power over any new release under the IMF Articles of Agreement. And this is exactly why we didn't see an SDR allocation during all of 2020. Even though it was asked for, the managing director of the IMF started calling for it, back in April of 2020. But the US Treasury under Donald Trump, so Secretary of the Treasury Mnuchin, was just opposed to any new SDRs, despite the fact that you had all the European countries, obviously African countries, Asian countries, with the exception of India, unfortunately, in 2020. That's changed since then. The IMF managing director, et cetera, all clamoring for SDRs. So in addition to this limitation, under US legislation, the US Treasury can only approve an issuance, a quantity of SDRs that is less than the US quota share at the IMF. And that's how we ended up with $650 billion this time. And that's what was allocated in August, $650 billion worth of SDRs, because that was the limit that Treasury could approve without congressional support. And so that's why we and other groups have taken the fight for more SDRs for developing countries to the US Congress, which brings me to the robust international response to the Pandemic Act. That's its name in the House. In the Senate, it has a slightly different name. I don't remember, but I can get that for you. And both of these pieces of legislation call for a few things, including suspending payments of multilateral debt during the pandemic. But really the most important thing is that they authorize the US Treasury to support an allocation, not of something within the quota share, or $650 billion, but much more, as much as 2 trillion SDRs. In the legislation that we had in the House last year, it was actually 3 trillion SDRs. So it was scaled back a little bit, including in amendments that ended up passing in the House of Representatives twice through, these were amendments that were added to the two different appropriations bills, calling for 2 trillion SDRs. That got through really thanks to a huge role played by the Progressive Caucus. Chuy Garcia was the guy who introduced the legislation in the House side, together with Jan Schakowsky and Mark Takano. And they got a lot of support from the Progressive Caucus, as well as a lot of key leaders in the House of Representatives, including Maxine Waters, who's the chair of the House Financial Services Committee, which is in charge of these sorts of issues. And ultimately, Nancy Pelosi ended up supporting it too. And so we got it passed twice in the House. This year, it's been passed again in the House of Representatives on another appropriations bill, essentially the same legislation, but both last year and this year, we've run into trouble in the Senate. Last year in particular, it was Republican controlled. They were just following instructions from the Trump administration. And so they were a brick wall. I think this time around, we're sensing a little bit more flexibility from some Republicans, but there are those that are, very opposed. Really for terrible reasons, geopolitical reasons. They say, if we support these SDRs, they're going to go to China, they're going to go to Syria, they're going to go to Iran, Russia. We don't want those countries to get SDRs. Therefore, every country in the world should be deprived of SDRs. So Republicans like French Hill, Tom Cotton, Adam Schiff, real headache. And so anyway, really it should be an easy sell, this legislation. Again, it costs taxpayers nothing. It's, if you're really just interested in your own interests and you don't care about the rest of the world, well, by helping boost the global economy, you're helping boost the US economy. And CEPR actually just came out with a paper a couple months ago showing how US exports declined enormously during COVID. Over 2 million jobs were lost, and making the clear-cut case that a boost in global demand from SDRs is going to help the US recover all those jobs and perhaps get additional jobs on top of those. But anyway, we're fighting hard. There are a big coalition of groups working on this. A number of them reach into red states, so we're hoping to be able to move Republicans on this. And even if the legislation doesn't get passed, I think just as was the case last year, it serves to send a really strong message to the US Treasury. And I think really that's how we ended up with $650 billion this year. It was much smaller amounts that were being discussed initially. Really the top amount that was being discussed was about $500 billion worth. We ended up getting $650 billion worth, and we know that our the champions of this legislation pushed Treasury very hard, and we think that that played really a critical role in getting the amount up to $650 billion. You know, really, unfortunately, that decision was ultimately in the hands of the US. I don't think any other countries objected to the amount being increased from $500 billion to $650 billion. So I just want to conclude by saying that none of everything that I've said about SDRs should absolve the IMF for its horrible policies. And I just want to highlight, for instance, that I think Oxfam came out with a report over the summer showing that something like 85% of loan agreements of the IMF, and they've done a lot because, as Jayati was pointing out, a lot of countries have had to go into debt in order to increase their public spending. They've been forced into more debt. And, you know, unfortunately, something like 85% of these loan agreements have involved, you know, very damaging austerity policies and, you know, public sector cuts and the like, at the very worst possible time, of course, during this pandemic. And another thing, CEPR just published a paper on IMF surcharges. It just came out today, showing that, you know, countries with high levels of debt to the IMF, I mean, this is a fact that many people know, but I don't think there's been sort of a detailed report on it and how, you know, it really violates actually the IMF's Articles of Agreement. Countries are forced to pay a surcharge on interest payments above a certain limit. So you've got very onerous interest rates that are being forced on countries that already have an enormous amount of debt. You know, there's the example of Argentina that's having to pay surcharges amounting to over $3 billion of payments, which is, we calculated it being 9 times the amount needed to vaccinate every Argentine, you know, at the current cost of vaccines. So anyway, again, none of anything I've said about SDRs absolves the IMF for their other policies. And there's some additional resources on SDRs I can share. There's a very good website that has a lot, globalcovidresponse.org. Also, I just want to mention that next week there is going to be, in addition to a panel on IMF surcharges that we're going to be doing with Jayati next week on Tuesday, I believe. On Monday morning, there's going to be a panel, a webinar in the context of the IMF World Bank meetings with my colleague Andres Arauz on IMF SDRs. I think that'll be a really good panel. It's got an IMF official on it, so we're expecting a spicy debate there. Thanks, and that's all I've had. I'm sure I've overrun my time. Sorry about that.
No, that was great. And so we do have a number of questions in the chat, but I want to pose one more before moving into audience questions, which is, you both in your comments talked about why SDRs are rather unique in the context of the IMF as an institution, but I wonder if you could talk about why SDRs are perhaps unique as a technical instrument that could perhaps plug in current gaps and also could facilitate further transformation of the international financial system and centers of global economic governance, if that makes sense. So I'll put it to both of you, whoever wants to jump in first.
I think Alex should go first on this.
And I'm muted, of course. Yeah, I missed the first part of the question. I caught the last bit.
Oh,
the last
sure.
bit didn't help me understand the first bit.
I had said that you both spoke to why SDRs are perhaps unique to the IMF as an institution, but I wondered if you could tell us why SDRs are unique in terms of the international financial system, and then like why there's a lot of urgency for us to be agitating on this, even absent the COVID-19 crisis.
Sure, yes. Well, I don't know if there are many fans of John Maynard Keynes among you, but he was, I think, one of the first people to dream of sort of a global currency and having sort of a global central bank. In a sense, the SDRs are, you know, inspired by that Keynesian dream, although they came about in the late 60s, when you had a big sort of liquidity problem globally. It had to do with the gold standard, the fact that there weren't enough dollars and gold to meet the needs of countries in terms of foreign exchange, in terms of their international reserves, and so they were created to produce supplementary liquidity to supplement international reserves and countries' central banks. And there were a few early issuances, and then they were completely forgotten about. And that had something to do with the fact that the US, got out of the gold standard, and of course, started producing a lot more dollars, and the world was flooded with dollars, and the rest is sort of history, and then there were a series of debt crises and all the rest. But at any rate, SDRs then unfortunately were sort of forgotten about. There was never a very big issuance, and then it was in 2009, following the global financial crisis, that some economists thought, well, this would actually be really handy. There's some, liquidity problems at the moment. Countries facing balance of payments problems, and SDRs, could really help do the trick. And so then you had a rather significant issuance of SDRs, around $250 billion worth of SDRs. And so, in answer to your question, because I'm not sure if I'm getting there, it's kind of new and experimental, and SDRs have the defects that both Jayati and I have mentioned. Of the structure of the allocation is all wrong, with so many of them going to wealthy countries, and the fact that it's the wealthy countries that control the issuance of these SDRs. And perhaps we could add to that the fact that, even though the IMF doesn't really get involved in how SDRs are used, they can potentially, and we're seeing that now with these rechanneling mechanisms that are being proposed, where the IMF would be very, very much involved, if these proposals go through, in rechanneling SDRs from the wealthy countries to the poorer countries. So very, very imperfect tool, but basically all that we've got at the moment. And I would say, something vaguely comparable is how the US Treasury is doing these sort of debt swaps with central banks, mostly of wealthy countries. So providing, lots of fresh US dollars to countries in exchange for their currencies. And that serves a purpose, I think. But SDRs are better than having the US Fed be in charge of everything. I think SDRs at least involve a basket of currencies with other currencies than just the dollar. They allow countries to exchange to other countries than just the dollar. So it doesn't, to the same extent, have to sort of strengthen the dollar, reinforce sort of the dominance of the dollar globally. It's a bit more multilateral as a system. So very imperfect, but kind of the best thing we've got. We're stuck still today in the Bretton Woods system, the post-war system, which was determined by the balance of powers after World War II, and that's what we've got. With what we've got, I think SDRs is the best thing we have in terms of providing these additional resources that countries need. But I welcome the worldwide revolution that will do away with the Bretton Woods system, so that we can move on to something that would be much more democratic than SDRs ultimately.
Great. And I wondered if you had anything to add on that question, Jayati.
Just very briefly, I completely agree with Alex about how it has all this huge potential despite the limitations. But there is one fundamental thing I believe about which Keynes was wrong, which is that, Keynes envisaged this world where you had these very well-meaning male economists who would decide on behalf of the world without narrow political interests and so on. And therefore, you would have an international bank with international liquidity, would create international money. I think he kind of left out one critical aspect of money. And Charles Kindleberger, the economist, I think he was at Yale, got it absolutely right. Money is about power. International money is about international power. The reason why you don't have an international money that is independent of the nation states is because it's about power, right? Global money, there's a reason why some countries have international reserve currencies and others don't. There's a reason why there's a hierarchy of currencies. It reflects global power. And a large part of many of the wars that the US has fought over the last half century has been about retaining that power. It's not necessarily about the oil. It's about showing the whole world that you can keep the oil if you want, and therefore our dollar is the best. So I think there is that tension between, the world as we know it and a better construction of an international financial architecture.
Well, I guess keeping with the theme of power, a few people in the Q&A have asked questions that I think are quite similar, so I might group them together if people will forgive me. But there's a common question around the fact that both of you have said that there's no real downsides to SDRs. They don't cost the US anything, even if that were a concern to begin with. So the question is, why are US politicians, making excuses about why they shouldn't be allocated or reallocated? Is it a matter of just spending political capital, or do you see otherwise tensions that we might want to be attacking or kind of be organizing against as we continue with this campaign?
Okay, I'm going to go first because I think Alex knows more about this than me, so he will have more detail. But from the outside, and I know nothing about the intricacies of domestic politics, but there are some aspects of US geopolitics which I think would be affected. First of all, the US actually likes a system where the world depends on US Federal Reserve swaps, which is the way it's been dealing with liquidity shortages in the world. It engages in currency swaps with its favored countries. So it's a way in which the US gets to decide which countries get access to liquidity. So it likes that system. It doesn't like a system which is completely norm-based, where it doesn't have any say over who gets how much. It has vehemently opposed and is in the IMF fighting to prevent Iran, Venezuela, and Afghanistan from getting access to SDRs, which are theirs definitionally. So it's actually trying, and I think it's so far succeeding in preventing these, bad countries from getting access to SDRs. But also, you have Republicans in Congress, forgive my saying so, you have Republicans in general who don't like anything to do with anything multilateral. They think all of it is a big conspiracy against the US, right? And there's a huge attack on Kristalina Georgieva because she was seen by Republicans in the US Congress as too soft on China. So I think there is a broader, shall we say, political culture in the US, which has become very Trumpian in a way, and therefore determined not to do anything multilateral. But Alex will have much more detail. Right?
No, I mean, I agree with that completely. I really think that those that are bringing up these geopolitical arguments, if you can even call them that, and saying that Iran and Afghanistan and other countries don't deserve SDRs, are going to put them to bad use and so on. I think really behind that all is exactly what Jayati said, which is that the US is wants to maintain its absolute control of the world financial system, and is very protective of the Fed and its powers, and so essentially the US is once again really being very anti-democratic in order to sort of ensure that it can impose its will for the foreseeable future. So yeah, really shoddy arguments, and I think we've been shooting them down, and But I think behind those arguments are, some sort of more nefarious things about, the US just not wanting there to be much global democracy.
Well, I think the question of global democracy is as good a place as any to move into questions of organizing and power. So I invite Tyler, who is a member of the DSA's International Committee's Subcommittee on Econ and Trade, who's been a main
Melanie, if you don't mind, can I do one sentence answers to two of the questions I noticed in Q&A, which I think are very important, actually. Somebody's asked, what about the end of neoliberalism? How is this playing into the pandemic response? And my response to that is, what end of neoliberalism? I mean, yes, maybe in the US, you are now spending more and giving child grant support and etc. I assure you that 70% of the population of the world is still suffering under very extreme neoliberalism, which is kicking hard at the moment. The other question is about US and China. And I think, again, seen from the outside, it's remarkable how everything is seen in terms of this threat from China. G7 meets in the middle of a pandemic and all they can talk about is the rise of China. It's very clear that the Northern obsession with China is a reflection of their own declining power, but it also means that they're going to drag the whole world with them. In other words, we're heading for apocalypse because they're so busy trying to maintain a relative power position and so unwilling, therefore, to cooperate on even the most basic level.
Yeah, and I just saw that there was a specific question about Ron Wyden. Yes, he actually has supported the Senate legislation. So that's good, but we really need to see the senators now making a real push, a public push to get this legislation passed. I think they've been a bit intimidated by some of the backlash from the Republicans and saying, you're trying to help communist China, the Islamic Republic of Iran and so on. And by the way, that whole argument that SDRs helps China, and I think the Republicans often say, these SDRs go straight to the Communist Party of China. I mean, that's just absurd. I mean, China, really like the US and like European countries, or most European countries anyway, Japan and so on, they don't need these SDRs. They have the resources that they need to carry out public spending without using SDRs. In fact, they don't use them. I mean, the record so far is that they have not used them. China hasn't used them. China has no intention of using them. Perhaps China will rechannel some of the SDRs in a good way to countries. We have to hope that'll happen. But this idea that we're somehow funding the Chinese Communist Party or whatever, it's just ridiculous. But again, these are typical Republican talking points. They can get away with a lot since there's no real fact checking on Fox News and elsewhere.
Great. Well, I think Tyler is at the ready to walk us through, again, returning to we are here to change the world and what are we going to do about it today. So over to you, Tyler.
Awesome. Thank you all so much. I want to again thank the panelists, Jayati and Alex, for joining us today and lending their voice to this critical discussion. As we know, COVID has brought us to a moment where we can release so many nations from their economic shackles in just kind of a really ironic way. And we as socialists and progressives at the belly of empire have a duty to those in the global south to seize the opportunity of this and really move. As Alex stated, we know there are some DSA-aligned politicians such as AOC who've yet to sign on, and we're hoping that with some light pressuring through a letter writing arm of this campaign, they'll be able to fight to release these SDRs with us as well. But we know that this won't be enough. Many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with DSA's ProAct campaign, where we made over 1 million calls to constituents across the country and got them to pressure their senators into voting on the side of labor. And with this campaign, we're planning to miniaturize that strategy to pressure senators in strategic places, such as Ohio, and to get them to support the just global recovery. But we're gonna need your help with this one. This Sunday at 7 is our first phone bank, and the more people we get on the dialer, the faster we're able to make calls just by the nature of how Through Talk works. And so sign up at the link that we're dropping below with the Google form and join us in the fight for a just global recovery.
Oh, I see that someone's asked Tyler, is that 7 Eastern? I would assume so, right?
Yes, 7 Eastern, sorry.
Great. Well, thank you so much. And I want to take a moment to thank Tyler as well, who's really been a driving force behind organizing this. And thank you to Jayati and Alex as well. Oh, and I think a note in the chat, this link is for DSA members specifically. So if you are not a DSA member, but you are interested in joining, we have other channels for getting involved as well.